Now that I've won my suit under the Freedom of Information Act, I'm at liberty to reveal for the first time a curious episode in my life that may be of interest not only to those engaged in research in the philosophy of mind, artificial intelligence, and neuroscience, but also to the general public. Several years ago, I was approached by the Pentagon officials who asked me to volunteer for a highly dangerous and secret mission. In collaboration with NASA and Howard Hughes, the Department of Defense was spending billions to develop supersonic tunneling underground device, or STUD. It was supposed to tunnel through the Earth's core at great speed and deliver a specially designed atomic warhead right up the Red's missile silos, as one of the Pentagon brass put it. The problem was that in early tests they had succeeded in lodging a warhead about a mile deep under Tulsa, Oklahoma, and they wanted me to retrieve it for them. Why me? I asked. Well, the mission involved some pioneering applications of current brain research, and they had heard of my interest in brains, and of course my Faustian curiosity and great courage and so forth. Well, how could I refuse? The difficulty that brought the Pentagon to my door was that the device I'd been asked to recover was fiercely radioactive in a new way. According to monitoring instruments, something about the nature of the device and its complex interactions with pockets of material deep in the earth had produced radiation that could cause severe abnormalities in certain tissues of the brain. No way had been found to shield the brain from these deadly rays, which were apparently harmless to other tissues and organs of the body. So, it had been decided that the person sent to recover the device should leave his brain behind. It would be kept in a safe place, as there it could execute its normal control functions by elaborate radio links. Would I submit to a surgical procedure that would completely remove my brain, which would then be placed in a life support system at the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston? Each input and output pathway, as it was severed, would be restored by a pair of micro-miniaturized radio transceivers, one attached precisely to the brain, the other to the nerve stumps in my empty cranium. No information would be lost. All the connectivity would be preserved. At first, I was a bit reluctant. Would it really work? The Houston brain surgeons encouraged me. Think of it, they said, as a mere stretching of the nerves. If your brain were just moved over an inch in your skull, that would not alter or impair your mind. We're simply going to make the nerves indefinitely elastic by splicing radio links into them. I was shown around the life support lab in Houston and saw the sparkling new vat in which my brain would be placed were I to agree. I met the large and brilliant support team of neurologists, hematologists, biophysicists, and electrical engineers, and, after several days of discussions and demonstrations, I agreed to give it a try. I was subjected to an enormous array of blood tests, brain scans, experiments, interviews, and the like. They took down my autobiography at great length, recorded tedious lists of my beliefs, hopes, fears, and tastes. They even listed my favorite stereo recording and gave me a crash session of psychoanalysis. The day for surgery arrived at last, and of course I was anesthetized and remembered nothing of the operation itself. When I came out of the anesthesia, I opened my eyes, looked around, and asked the inevitable, the traditional, the lamentably hackneyed post-operative question, where am I? The nurse smiled down at me. You're in Houston, she said, and I reflected that this still had a good chance of being the truth one way or another. She handed me a mirror. Sure enough, there were the tiny antennae poking out through their titanium ports cemented into my skull. I gather the operation was a success, I said. I went to go see my brain. They led me, I was a bit dizzy and unsteady, down a long corridor and into the life support lab. A cheer went up from the assembled support team, and I responded with what I hoped was a jaunty salute. Still feeling lightheaded, I was helped over to the life support vat. I peered through the glass. There, floating in what looked like ginger ale, I was undeniably a human brain, though it was almost covered with printed circuit chips, plastic tubules, electrodes, and other paraphernalia. Is that mine? I asked. Hit the output transmitter, switch on the side of the vat, and see for yourself, the project director replied. I moved the switch to off, and immediately slumped, groggy and nauseated, into the arms of the technicians, one of whom kindly restored the switch to its on position. While I recovered my equilibrium and composure, I thought to myself, well, Here I am, sitting on a folding chair, staring through a piece of plate glass at my own brain. But wait, I said to myself. Shouldn't I have thought, here I am, suspended in a bubbling fluid, being stared at by my own eyes? I tried to think this latter thought. I tried to project it into the tank, offering it hopefully to my brain, but I failed to carry off the exercise with conviction. I tried again. Here am I, Daniel Dennett, suspended in a bubbling fluid, being stared at by my own eyes. No, it just didn't work. My puzzling and confusing, being a philosopher of firm physical conviction, I believed unswervingly that the tokening of my thoughts was occurring somewhere in my brain. Yet, when I thought, here am I, where that thought occurred to me was here, outside the vat, not where I, Dennett, standing staring at my brain. I tried and tried to think myself into the vat, but to no avail. I tried to build up to the task by doing mental exercises. I thought to myself, the sun is shining over there, 5 times in rapid succession, each time mentally ascending a different place in order: the sunlit corner of the lab, the visible front lawn of the hospital, Houston, Mars, and Jupiter. I found I had little difficulty in getting my theirs to hop all over the celestial map with their proper references. I could loft a there in an instant through the furthest reaches of space, and then aim the next there with pinpoint accuracy at the upper left quadrant of the freckle on my arm. Why was I having such trouble with here? Here in Houston worked well enough, and so did here in the lab, and even here in this part of the lab, but here in the vat always seemed merely an unmeant mental mouthing. I tried closing my eyes while thinking it. This seemed to help, but I still couldn't manage to pull it off, except perhaps for a fleeting instant. I couldn't be sure. The discovery that I couldn't be sure was also unsettling. How did I know where I meant by here when I thought here? Could I think one thing when I meant another? I didn't see how this could be admitted without untying a few bonds of intimacy between a person and his own mental life that has survived the onslaught of the brain scientists and philosophers, the physicalists and behaviorists. Perhaps I was incorrigible where I meant when I said here, but in my present circumstances, it seemed either I was doomed by sheer force of mental habit to thinking systematically false indexical thoughts, or where a person is, and hence where his thoughts are tokened for purposes of semantic analysis, is not necessarily where his brain, the physical seat of his soul, resides. Nagged by confusion, I attempt to orient myself by falling back on a favorite philosopher's ploy. I began naming things. Yorick, I said aloud to my brain. You are my brain. The rest of my body, seated in this chair, I dub Hamlet. So here we are. Yorick's my brain, Hamlet's my body, and I am Dennett. Now, where am I? And when I think, where am I? Where's that thought tokened? Is it tokened in my brain, lounging about in the vat, or right here between my ears where it seems to be tokened? Or nowhere? Its temporal coordinates give me no trouble. Must it not have spatial coordinates as well? I began making a list of the alternatives. 1. Where Hamlet goes, there goes Dennett. This principle was easily refuted by appeal to the familiar brain transplant thought experiments so enjoyed by philosophers. If Tom and Dick switch brains, Tom is the fellow with Dick's former body. Just ask him. He'll claim to be Tom and tell you the most intimate details of Tom's autobiography. It was clear enough then that my current body and I could part company, but not likely that I could be separated from my brain. The rule of thumb that emerged so plainly from the thought experiments was that in a brain transplant operation, one wanted to be the donor, not the recipient. Better to call such an operation a body transplant, in fact. So perhaps the truth was 2. Where York goes, there goes Dennett. This was not at all appealing, however. How could I be in the vat and not about to go anywhere when I was so obviously outside the vat, looking in and beginning to make guilty plans to return to my room for a substantial lunch? This begged the question, I realized, but it still seemed to be getting at something important. Casting about for some support for my intuition, I hit upon a legalistic sort of argument that might have appealed to Locke. Suppose, I argued to myself, I were to now fly to California, rob a bank, and be apprehended. In which state would I be tried? In California, where the robbery took place, or in Texas, where the brains of the outfit were located? Would I be a California felon with an out-of-state brain, or a Texas felon remotely controlling an accomplice of sorts in California? It seemed possible that I might beat such a rap just on the undecidability of the jurisdictional question, though perhaps it would be deemed an interstate and hence federal offense. In any event, I suppose I were convicted. Was it likely that California would be satisfied to throw Hamlet into the brig, knowing that York was living the good life and luxuriously taking the waters in Texas? Would Texas incarcerate York, leaving Hamlet free to take the next boat to Rio? This alternative appealed to me. Barring capital punishment or other cruel and unusual punishment, the state would be obliged to maintain the life support system for York, though they might move him from Houston to Leavenworth. And aside from the unpleasantness of the opprobrium, I, for one, would not mind at all and would consider myself a free man under those circumstances. If the state has an interest in forcibly relocating persons in institutions, it would fail to relocate me in any institution by locating York there. If this were true, it suggested a third alternative. Dennett is wherever he thinks he is. Generalized, the claim was as follows. At any given time, a person has a point of view, and the location of point of view, which is determined internally by the content of the point of view, is also the location of the person. Such a proposition is not without its perplexities, but to me it seemed a step in the right direction. The only trouble was that it seemed to place one in a heads-I-win, tails-you-lose situation of unlikely infallibility as regards location. Hadn't I myself often been wrong about where I was, and at least as often uncertain? Couldn't one get lost? Of course, but getting lost geographically is not the only way one might get lost. If one were lost in the woods, one could attempt to reassure oneself with consolation that at least one knew where one was. One was right here, in the familiar surroundings of one's own body. Perhaps in this case, one would not have drawn one's attention too much to be thankful for. Still, there were worse plights imaginable, and I wasn't sure I wasn't in such a plight right now. Point of view clearly had something to do with personal location, but it was itself an unclear notion. It was obvious that the content of one's point of view was not the same or as determined by the content of one's beliefs or thoughts. For example, what should we say about the point of view of the Cinerama viewer, who shrieks and twists in his seat as the roller coaster footage overcomes his psychic distancing? Has he forgotten that he is safely seated in the theater? Here I was inclined to say that the person is experiencing an illusory shift in one's point of view. In other cases, my inclination to call such shifts illusory was less wrong. The workers in laboratories and plants who handle dangerous materials by operating feedback-controlled mechanical arms and hands undergo a shifted point of view that is crisper and more pronounced than anything Cinerama can provide. They can feel the heft and slipperiness of the containers they manipulate with their metal fingers. They know perfectly well where they are and are not fooled into false beliefs by the experience. Yet it is as if they were inside the isolation chamber they're peering into. With mental effort, they can manage to shift their point of view back and forth, rather like making a transparent Necker cube or an Escher drawing change orientation before one's eyes. It does seem extravagant to suppose that in performing this bit of mental gymnastics, they are transporting themselves back and forth. Still, their example gave me hope, and I was in fact in the vat in spite of my intuitions, and might be able to train myself to adopt that point of view, even as a matter of habit. I should dwell on images of myself comfortably floating in my vat, beaming volitions, that familiar body out there. I reflected that the ease or difficulty of this task was presumably independent of the truth about the location of one's brain. Had I been practicing before the operation, I might now be finding it second nature. You might now yourself try such a jump. Imagine you have written an inflammatory letter which has been published in the Times, the result of which is that the government has chosen to impound your brain for a probationary period of 3 years in its dangerous brain clinic in Bethesda, Maryland. Your body of course, is allowed freedom to earn salary and thus continue its function of flaying up income to be taxed. At this moment, however, your body is seated in an auditorium listening to a peculiar account by Daniel Dennett of his own similar experience. Try it. Think yourself in Bethesda, and then hark back longingly to your body, far away, and yet seeming so near. It is only with long distance restraint, yours, the government's, that you can control your impulse to get those hands clapping in polite applause before navigating the old body to the restroom and a well-deserved glass of evening sherry in the lounge. The task of imagination is certainly difficult, but if you achieve your goal, the results might be consoling. Anyway, there I was in Houston, lost in thought, as one might say, but not for long. My speculations were soon interrupted by the Houston doctors, who wished to test out my new prosthetic nervous system before sending me off on my hazardous mission. As I mentioned before, I was a bit dizzy at first, and, not surprisingly, although I soon habituated myself to my new circumstances, which were, after all, well nigh indistinguishable from my old circumstances, my accommodation was not perfect, however. And to this day, I continue to be plagued by minor coordination difficulties. The speed of light is fast, but finite, and as my brain and body move farther and farther apart, the delicate interaction of my feedback system is thrown into disarray by the time lags. Just as one is rendered close to speechless by a delayed or echoing hearing of one's speaking voice. For instance, I am virtually unable to track a moving object with my eyes whenever my brain and my body are more than a few miles apart. In most matters, my impairment is scarcely indetectable, though I can no longer hit a slow curveball with the authority of yore. There are some compensations, of course. The liquor tastes as good as ever and warms my gullet while corroding my liver. I can drink it in any quantity I please without becoming the slightest bit inebriated, a curiosity some of my friends have noticed, though I occasionally have feigned inebriation so as not to draw attention to my unusual circumstances. For similar reasons, I take aspirin orally for a sprained wrist, but if the pain persists, I ask Houston to administer codeine to me in vitro. In times of illness, the phone bill can be staggering. But, to return to my adventure, at length, both the doctors and I were satisfied that I was ready to undertake my subterranean mission. And so, I left my brain in Houston and headed by helicopter for Tulsa. Well, in any case, that's the way it seemed to me. That's how I would put it. Just off the top of my head, as it were. On the trip, I reflected further about my earlier anxieties and decided that my first post-operative speculations had been tinged with panic. The matter was not so nearly as strange or metaphysical as I had been supposing. Where was I? In two places, clearly. Both inside the vat and outside it. Just as one can stand with one foot in Connecticut and the other in Rhode Island. I was in two places at once. I had become one of those scattered individuals we used to hear so much about. The more I considered this answer, the more obviously true it appeared. But, strange to say, the more true it appeared, the less important the question to which it could be the true answer seemed. A sad but not unprecedented fate for a philosophical question to suffer. This answer did not completely satisfy me, of course. There lingered some question to which I should have liked the answer, which was neither, where are all my various and sundry parts, nor what is my current point of view, or at least there seemed to be such a question. For it did seem undeniable that in some sense I, and not merely most of me, was descending into the earth under Tulsa in search of an atomic warhead. When I found the warhead, I was certainly glad I had left my brain behind, for the pointer on the specially built Geiger counter I brought with me was off the dial. I called Houston on my ordinary radio and told the Operation Control Center of my position and my progress. In return, they gave me instructions for dismantling the vehicle based upon my on-site observations. I had set to work with my cutting torch when all of a sudden a terrible thing happened. I went stone deaf. At first, I thought it was my only radio earphones that had broken, but when I tapped on my helmet, I heard nothing. Apparently, the auditory transceivers had gone on the fritz. I could no longer hear Houston or my own voice, but I could speak, so I started telling them what had happened. In mid-sentence, I knew something else had gone wrong. My vocal apparatus had become paralyzed. Then, my right hand went limp. Another transceiver had gone. I was truly in deep trouble. But worse was to follow. After a few more minutes, I went blind. I cursed my luck, and then I cursed the scientist who had led me into this grave peril. There I was, deaf, dumb, and blind in a radioactive hole more than a mile under Tulsa. Then the last of my cerebral radio links broke, and suddenly I was faced with a new and even more shocking problem. Whereas an instant before I had been buried alive in Oklahoma, now I was disembodied in Houston. My recognition of new status was not immediate. It took me several very anxious minutes before it dawned on me that my poor body lay several hundred miles away, with heart pulsing and lungs respirating, but otherwise dead as any other heart transplant donor, its skull packed with useless, broken electronic gear. The shift in perspective I had earlier found well nigh impossible now seemed quite natural. Though I could think myself back into my body in the tunnel under Tulsa, it took some effort to sustain the illusion. For surely it was an illusion to suppose I was still in Oklahoma. I had lost all contact with that body. It occurred to me then, with one of those rushes of revelation of which we should be suspicious, that I had stumbled upon an impressive demonstration of the immaterial of the soul, based on physical principles and premises. For as the last radio signal between Tulsa and Houston died away, had I not changed location from Tulsa to Houston at the speed of light? And had I not accomplished this without any increase in mass? What moved from A to B at such speed was surely myself, or at any rate, my soul or mind, the massless center of my being and home of my consciousness. My point of view had lagged somewhat, but I had already noted the indirect bearing of point of view on personal location. I could not see how a physical philosopher could quarrel with this aspect by taking the dire and counterintuitive route of banishing all talk of persons. Yet the notion of personhood was so well entrenched in everyone's worldview, or so it seemed to me, that any denial would be so curiously unconvincing and systematically disingenuous as the Cartesian negation non sum. The joy of philosophic discovery thus tided me over some bad minutes, or perhaps hours, as the helplessness and hopelessness of my situation became more apparent to me. Waves of panic and even nausea swept over me, made all the more horrible by the absence of their normal body dependent phenomenology. No adrenaline rush of tingles in the arms, no pounding heart, no premonitory salivation. I did feel a dread, sinking feeling in my bowels at one point, and this tricked me momentarily into the false hope that I was undergoing a reversal of the process that landed me in this fix. A gradual undisembodiment. But the isolation and uniqueness of that twinge soon convinced me that it was simply the first of a plague of phantom body hallucinations that I, like any other amputee, would be all too likely to suffer. My mood then was chaotic. On the one hand, I was fired up with elation of my philosophic discovery and was racking my brain, one of the few familiar things I could still do, trying to figure out how to communicate my discovery to the journals. While, on the other, I was bitter, lonely, and filled with dread and uncertainty. Fortunately, this did not last long, for my technical support team sedated me into a dreamless sleep, from which I awoke, hearing with magnificent fidelity and familiar opening strains of my favorite Brahms piano trio. So that was why they had wanted a list of my favorite recordings. It did not take me long to realize that I was hearing the music without ears. The output from the stereo stylus was being fed through some fancy rectification circuitry directly into my auditory nerve. I was mainlining Brahms, an unforgettable experience for any stereo buff. At the end of the record, it did not surprise me to hear the reassuring voice of the project director speaking into a microphone that was now my prosthetic ear. He confirmed my analysis of what had gone wrong and assured me the steps were being taken to re-embody me. He did not elaborate, and after a few more recordings, I found myself drifting off to sleep. My sleep lasted, I later learned, for the better part of a year, and when I awoke, it was to find myself fully restored to my senses. When I looked into the mirror, though, I was a bit startled to see an unfamiliar face. bearded and a bit heavier, bearing no doubt a family resemblance to my former face, and with the same look of sprightly intelligence and resolute character, but I definitely had a new face. Further self-explorations of an intimate nature left me no doubt that this was a new body, and the project director confirmed my conclusions. He did not volunteer any information on the past history of my new body, and I decided, wisely I think in retrospect, not to pry. As many philosophers unfamiliar with my ordeal have more recently speculated, the acquisition of a new body leaves one's person intact, and after a period of adjustment to a new voice, new muscular strengths and weaknesses, and so forth, one's personality is by and large also preserved. More dramatic changes in personality have been routinely observed in people who have undergone extensive plastic surgery, to say nothing of sex change operations, and I think no one contests the survival of the person in such cases. In the event, I soon accommodated to my new body, to the point of being unable to recover any of its novelties to my consciousness, or even my memory. The view in the mirror soon became utterly familiar. That view, by the way, still revealed antennae, and so I was not surprised to learn that my brain had not been moved from its haven in the life support lab. I decided that good old York deserved a visit, and when my new body, whom we might as well call Fortinbras, strode into the familiar lab to another round of applause from the technicians, who were, of course, congratulating themselves, not me. Once more, I stood before the vat and contemplated poor Yorick, and on a whim, I once again cavalierly flicked off the output transmitter switch. Imagine my surprise when nothing unusual happened. No fainting smell, no nausea, no noticeable change. A technician hurried to restore the switch to on, but still I felt nothing. I demanded an explanation, which the project director hastened to provide. It seemed that before they had even operated on the first occasion, they had constructed a computer duplicate of my brain, reproducing both the complete information processing structure and the computational speed of my brain in a giant computer program. After the operation, but before they had dared to send me off into a mission in Oklahoma, they had run the computer system and York side by side. The incoming signals from Hamlet were sent simultaneously to York's transceivers and to the computer's array of inputs. And the outputs from York were not only beamed back to Hamlet, my body, they were recorded and checked against the simultaneous output of the computer program, which was called Hubert, for reasons obscure to me. Over days and weeks, the outputs were identical and synchronous, which of course did not prove that they had successfully succeeded in copying the brain's functional structure, but the empirical support was greatly encouraging. Hubert's input, and hence activity, had been kept parallel with York's during my disembodied days. And now, to demonstrate this, they had actually thrown the master switch that put Hubert for the first time in online control of my body. Not Hamlet, of course, but Fortinbras. Hamlet, I learned, had never been recovered from its underground tomb, and could be assumed by this time to have largely reduced to dust. At the head of my grave still lay the magnificent bulk of the abandoned device, with the word stud emblazoned on its side in large letters, a circumstance which may provide archaeologists of the next century with a curious insight into the burial rites of their ancestors. The laboratory technicians now showed me the master switch, which had two positions labeled B for brain — they didn't know my brain's name with York — and H for Hubert. The switch did indeed point to H, and they explained to me that if I wished, I could switch it back to B. With my heart in my mouth and my brain in its vat, I did this. Nothing happened. A click, that was all. To test their claim, and with their master switch now set at B, I hit York's output transmitter switch on the vat, and sure enough, I began to faint. Once the output switch was turned back on, and I had recovered my wits, so to speak, I continued to play with the master switch, flipping it back and forth. I found that with the exception of the transitional click, I could detect no trace of a difference. I could switch mid-utterance, and the sentence I had begun speaking under the control of York was finished with a pause or without a pause, or a hitch of any kind under the control of Hubert. I had a spare brain, a prosthetic device which might someday stand in me very good stead. Some mishap might befall York, and alternatively, I could keep York as a spare and use Hubert. It didn't seem to make any difference which I chose. for the wear and tear and fatigue of my body did not have any debilitating effect on either brain, whether or not it was actually causing the motions of my body or merely spilling its output into the air. The one truly unsettling aspect of this new development was the prospect, which was not long in dawning on me, of someone detaching the spare, Hubert or York, as the case may be, from Fortinbras and hitching it yet to another body, some Johnny come lately Rosencrantz or Guildenstern. Then, if not before, there would be two people. That much was clear. One would be me, and the other would be a sort of a super twin brother. If there were two bodies, one under the control of Hubert and the other being controlled by York, then which would the world recognize as the true Dennett? And whatever the rest of the world decided, which one would be me? Would I be the York brain one, in virtue of York's casual priority and former intimate relationship with the original Dennett body, Hamlet? That seemed a bit legalistic, a bit too redolent of the arbitrariness of consanguinity and legal possession to be convincing at the metaphysical level. For suppose that the arrival of the second body on the scene, I had been keeping York as a spare for years, and letting Hubert's output drive my body, that is, Fortinbras, all that time. The Hubert-Fortinbras couple would seem then, by the squatter's rights, to combat one legal intuition with another, to be the true Dennett and the lawful inheritor of everything that was Dennett's. This was an interesting question, certainly, but not nearly so pressing as another question that bothered me. My strongest intuition in that such eventuality, I would survive so long as either brain couple remained intact, but I had mixed emotions about whether I should want both to survive. I discussed my worries with the technicians and the project director. The prospect of two Dennets was abhorrent to me, I explained, largely for social reasons. I didn't want to be my own rival for the affections of my wife, nor did I like the prospect of two Dennets sharing my modest professor's salary. Still more vertiginous and distasteful, though, was the idea that knowing that much about another person, while he had the very same goods on me, how could we ever face each other? My colleagues in the lab argued that I was ignoring the bright side of the matter. Weren't there many things I wanted to do, but being only one person, had been unable to do? Now Daddy could stay at home and be the professor and family man, while the other could strike out on a life of travel and adventure. Missing the family, of course, but happy in the knowledge that the other Dennett was keeping the home and fires burning. I could be faithful and adulterous at the same time. I could even cuckold myself, to say nothing of the more lurid possibilities my colleagues were all too ready to force upon my overtaxed imagination. But my ordeal in Oklahoma, or was it Houston, had made me less adventurous, and I shrank from the opportunity that was being offered. Though, of course, I was never quite sure it was being offered to me in the first place. There was another prospect even more disagreeable, that the spare, Hubert or York, as the case may be, would be detached from any input from Fortinbras and just left detached. Then, as in the other case, there would be two Dennets, or at least two claimants to my name and possessions, one embodied in Fortinbras, and the other, sadly, miserably disembodied. Both selfishness and altruism bade me take steps to prevent this from happening. So I asked that measures be taken to ensure that no one could ever tamper with my transceiver connections or the master switch without my knowledge and consent. Since I had no desire to spend my life guarding the equipment in Houston, it was mutually decided that all the electronic connections in the lab would be carefully locked. Both those that controlled the life support system for York and those that controlled the power supply for Hubert would be guarded with failsafe devices, and I would take the only master switch, outfitted for radio remote control, with me wherever I went. I carry it strapped around my waist, and wait a moment. Yes, here it is. Every few months, I reconnoiter the situation by switching channels. I do this only in the presence of friends, of course, for if the other channel were, heaven forbid, either dead or otherwise occupied, there would have to be somebody who had my interests at heart to switch it back, to bring me back from the void. For while I could feel, see, hear, and otherwise sense whatever befell my body, subsequent to such a switch, I'm unable to control it. By the way, the two positions on the switch are intentionally unmarked, so I never have the faintest idea whether I'm switching from Hubert to York or vice versa. Some of you may think that in the case I really don't know who I am, let alone where I am, but such reflections no longer make much of a dent on my essential denatedness. only my own sense of who I am. If it is true, then in one sense I don't know who I am, and then the other's one of your philosophical truths in underwhelming insignificance. In any case, every time I flipped the switch so far, something's happened. So, let's give it a try. Thank God! I thought you'd never flip that switch! You can't imagine how horrible it's been these last 2 weeks. But now you know. It's your turn in purgatory. How I've longed for this moment. You see, about 2 weeks ago, excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, but I've got to explain this to my, brother, I guess you could say. But he's just told you the facts, so you'll understand. About 2 weeks ago, our two brains drifted just a bit out of sync. I don't know whether my brain is now Hubert or York, any more than you do. But in any case, the two brains drifted apart, and of course, when the process started, it snowballed, for I was in slightly different receptive state from the input we both received. A difference that was soon magnified. In no time at all, the illusion that I was in control of my body, our body, was completely dissipated. There was nothing I could do, no way to call you. You didn't even know I existed. It's been like being carried around in a cage, or better, like being possessed, hearing your own voice say things I didn't mean to say, watching in frustration as my own hands performed deeds I hadn't intended. You'd scratch your itches, but not the way I would have, and you kept me awake with your tossing and turning. I've been totally exhausted, on the verge of a nervous breakdown, carried around helplessly by your frantic round of activities, sustained only by the knowledge that someday you'd throw the switch. Now, it's your turn, but at least you'll have the comfort of knowing I know you're in there, like an expectant mother I'm eating, or at any rate tasting, smelling, seeing for two now. I'll try to make it easy for you, don't worry. Just as soon as the colloquialism is over, you and I will fly to Houston, and we'll see what can be done about getting you another body. You could have a female body. Your body can be any color you want. But let's think it over. I tell you what, to be fair, if we both want this body, I promise I'll let the project director flip a coin to settle which of us gets to keep it, and then who gets to choose a new body. That should guarantee justice, shouldn't it? In any case, I'll take care of you. I promise. These people are my witnesses. Ladies and gentlemen, this talk we have just heard is not exactly the talk I would have given, but I assure you that everything he said was perfectly true. And now, if you'll excuse me, I think we'd better sit down.